Hi, this is Mike Gant, and this is episode 13 of Biblical Living, and we're talking about decision making. We spent the first, last couple of episodes talking about a man named Nabal and his wife named Abigail in the story from 1 Samuel 25. It's kind of a lengthy story, but it's a meaty story, and it's a very interesting story. And we saw how Nabal, this guy whose name means folly, lived a foolish life. I mean, he was savvy in one sense, in that he was a prosperous man. He had flocks. He had property, and he was, known as a well-off man. But he was not at all generous, nor was he thankful for the protection that David and his men had given him. And he just did not have a good sense of getting along with people and being a contributing member of society. His wife Abigail, by contrast, was a very wise woman. And when Nabal goofed up big time by refusing to provide for David and his soldiers, who had protected his property for an extended period of time, along with the property of others in that area, David was looking out for his fellow Jews. And Nabal, as I say, foolishly refused to contribute, when the hat was passed for them. And Abigail immediately went to work. She put together a bunch of supplies. She didn't tell Nabal anything, and get some of the servants together, and they get on the road, and they're going out there to David hadn't been there. David had sent his men, and so they go back to tell David that they got denied when they asked for some support. And so she wanted to get to David before he got back to them, because she knew it was going to be trouble. So she was smart. She was a wise woman. And so she takes all these supplies, and then she goes to David, and she bows down, and she seeks his favor, and he comes to his senses. He decides, I shouldn't be taking my own revenge here. This is a good woman, so let me accept her gifts and show some mercy, so that I don't bring trouble on myself by trying to take justice into my own hands. So all that's fine. Nabal hears about it, and he was drunk and had a hangover at the time, and then he just dies. That doesn't go into a lot of detail about exactly why he died, but obviously he just couldn't he couldn't admit that he was wrong about something. That's a pretty serious unwillingness to admit you're wrong. Doesn't say he committed suicide or anything, but anyway, it doesn't end well. So that was a clear-cut case where a man has a wise wife and doesn't listen to counsel. So our subject that we're studying is decision-making, how you make decisions. Well, one of the ways you make decisions is by having good advice. And, we all should be advised by the wise people around us. And a man should especially be advised by his wife, because no one is more committed to him than his wife. At least that's God's order. That's God's expectation. So she should not have hidden motives. She ought to want the best for her husband and for herself, for that matter. And hopefully a man marries a wise woman. Well, here's a guy that's just blowing it big time. Nabal does not recognize that he has a wise wife, and he doesn't take her advice. But part of the reason I told that story was to contrast it with the one that we have at the very beginning of the Bible in the book of Genesis about Adam and Eve. Because Eve's wife did not provide a good example Eve did not provide a good example for her husband, Adam. Now, it wasn't exactly a situation where she was giving him advice. It's more, she just went off on her own, and she didn't seek his advice. If you go back and read the story of Adam and Eve, in Genesis 1, it just says, generally speaking, God created man, male and female, he made them. But the account goes into detail. Moses, who wrote the book of Genesis, puts the detail, or some of the detail, in Genesis chapter 2. And it says in verse 15, then the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. The Lord God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you eat from it, you will surely die. Then the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him. So the instruction God gave about the forbidden fruit was given before Eve was created. He tells Adam, Eve wasn't there. Then after that, he decides to make a helper for Adam. They look at all the animals, decide, no, none of these are not suitable. And so he says in verse 21, so the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. Then he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh at that place. The Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man and brought her to the man. So here's the woman now with the man, but the only way she's going to know about that prohibition is if her husband tells her, because as I said, she wasn't there when he was given that instruction. We know that he did give her that instruction because it says in the next chapter, chapter 3, it says, now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, indeed, has God said, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden? The woman said to the serpent, from the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat. But from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat from it or touch it, or you will die. Now, she doesn't get exactly what God said. And we don't know from this whether it's because Adam didn't get her the details correctly, or whether she wasn't paying attention properly, or maybe a combination of both. Maybe both Adam and Eve erred in the fact that she was kind of uncertain of exactly what the instruction had been, and Satan is going to take advantage of this. Now, it doesn't say in chapter 3 where Adam was, but Paul says something very interesting in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 14, talking about this. He doesn't tell us how he knew this. I presume it was something that the rabbis back then just they knew. Maybe it had been passed down over the centuries, like many other things. But as I said in 1 Timothy 2:14, well, starting with verse 13, Paul says, for it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. All right, we just talked about that. Adam's first created. He hears the command, the prohibition, and then after that, Eve is created. For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. So Paul is explaining to us what we can read for ourselves in verse 3, that the woman just became confused. Satan had confused her. And doesn't mean that she's ditzy or something. It just means that Satan's really good at confusing people. And we don't see Adam anywhere around. He's not, if he is around, he's not speaking up and interrupting him. So the Satan convinces the woman to do this, and she gets deceived. So it's the opposite situation of Nabal and Abigail, where Nabal, you got this worthless man with a wise wife that he won't listen to. And then here, with Adam and Eve, you got a wife who becomes deceived, so she doesn't have any good advice to give, and all she can do is basically set a bad example. And then Adam follows it. It says in chapter 3, he goes on to say that she eats, and then he does the same thing without any further explanation. So he follows her. So I want to say more about this difference between Adam and Eve on the one hand and Nabal and Abigail on the other, But we're out of time for this episode, so I hope you will listen to the next one. But that's something to chew on right there.